And with me today, I have Eunice Njau, founder, Eden Climate Center. We also have Tobias Belle, Communications Kenya Climate Innovation Center, that's KCIC. And we will be discussing all things Kenya's climate agenda. So they're with me in studio. How are you today, both of you?
Fine, thank you.
Feeling good?
Feeling good, thank you.
I love your tie. I love the color of your blazer. I can see everyone's looking smart as we discuss serious business.
Oh, yeah.
Or should we say green business?
Yeah,
Green business.
That sounds more like it, right? So today we're going to be touching on Kenya's climate agenda and how basically Kenya, wants countries like the US to pay up, all right? Now, on the contrary, the US president says climate change is fake, and that's one of the things that, of course, was mentioned. But apart from that, there's a lot more that we will be looking into. Now, I'll start off with what you think about President Ruto's speech at the UNGA 80 on climate issues. So we'll start off with you, Tobias.
Thank you very much. President Ruto painted a very bold vision as far as climate action is concerned.
Okay.
He painted the potential in Africa, the potential in Kenya. And he did mention that those who look to the future with vision can see that climate change is not only the greatest existential threat, but also a transformation opportunity for Kenya and for the world, really.
Right.
And that speaks to the huge opportunity of addressing climate change, both at the intersection of innovation and entrepreneurship, and using it to transform society, to transform countries, both to address climate change on the one hand and address development issues on the other.
Okay.
So I would say it painted a picture, an ambitious picture, and it also touched on very pertinent issues around the global financial architecture. It touched on multilateralism. It touched on what Africa needs to do locally to not just complain, but be a solutions provider on matters climate change. So I would say he tried to address most of the pertinent issues that pertain to this particular topic.
All right. And what about you, Eunice? What is the take? What is your take on President Ruto's speech and views?
I would just add on to what Tobias has mentioned. Specifically, I love the idea of highlighting the achievements of the UN and the purpose it has served over time in human history. And then he went down to saying how now we are at a crossroads, right? And it's important that the UN creates a new structure for itself, specifically bringing in now the African continent, particularly into the seat, and ensuring that we have at least 2 representatives from the African continent. And I loved how he also addressed the issue of the creation of the UN as the Bretton Woods Conference. As a result of the Bretton Woods, what Richard would say, it's the unholy trinity, the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. So it's important that we restructure the global financial architecture. And that's a huge task, considering that the African community needs to have one voice in order to achieve such a target. Yeah.
And as we speak, do you think that we are divided when it comes to the African voice?
Honestly, that's my opinion would be, to some extent we are.
Okay.
So if we ask all countries from the South Africa to Liberia to Morocco whether they actually agree with the sentiments,
yes,
I'm sure we'd have a divide. Yeah, we're still struggling to implement the ACFA and everything related to it. So we have a long way to go. Yeah.
All right.
That's my opinion.
Now, President William Ruto also noted that for Kenya to be able to implement its NDCs, which is the nationally determined contributions, it will require $56 billion US, right? How exactly do you think this implementation is going to be conducted, realistically, in your view, Tobias?
Thank you very much. The figure 56 billion, that's about 7.2 trillion Kenya shillings, if my math serves me correctly.
Approximately.
Yeah, so it is an ambitious goal, and it is captured in Kenya's second set of NDCs from 2031 to 2035. And the NDCs actually breaks it down. This is not a figure that can be achieved from one source, whether it's from external donors or even from government alone. It has to be a blended kind of finance model.
Yes.
And around 19% of that figure is projected to come from catalytic public finance. to de-risk investment in the green space, but also a huge component of it, about 81%, is projected to come from the private sector as an investor in this particular space.
Okay.
So looking at the private sector as an engine towards achieving the green transition that Kenya is looking towards. And the Kenya's second NDCs paint a vision of a whole of government, a whole of society approach. Now, this financing is meant to go towards mitigation, it's meant to go towards adaptation, but you realize that a lot of emphasis is being laid on the private sector. From our lived experience, we've seen a lot of potential in the private sector. At KCIC alone, we've supported almost 3,500 green ventures in the country and across the region. Now, these are actual innovations coming out of Kenya, whether it's in clean cooking, whether it's in circular economy, whether it's in climate smart agriculture, whether it's in water, e-mobility and all that. So there's huge potential there.
Right. And
through this sort of blended finance and a whole of society approach, I do think that the ambition is not too far from reach. Yeah.
All right. What about you, Eunice?
I would totally agree with Tobias and add that we have a very strong policy framework, if only we followed it through. So for example, we have the laws which regulate matters to do with climate financing, right? So if counties, for example, streamlined climate change and ensure that the finances which flow, because as Tobias is saying, part of the financing will be locally driven, and some will definitely be internationally driven as well. So for the locally driven financing, can we ensure that our counties, for example, streamline climate change so that the finances the financing which is released from, for example, national treasury is directed towards realizing the national priorities which we have set in the NDCs. Then secondly, we have the, what do we call it, the Kenya Green Finance Taxonomy, where we aim to ensure that at least the financing also, which is directed from the banks and institutions which lend finances, is directed towards realizing sustainable development projects, right? And so of importance, in order for us to bridge that gap, I think strong leadership, innovation, right, and accountability from the duty bearers as well as the citizens who receive this, who are the recipients of this cash flow, is required so that we can bridge that gap which the president has already highlighted, and it's in the NDC as well. Yeah.
All right. You mentioned climate financing from international donors, of course, from the global community. Do you think that the goodwill still exists towards climate financing in Kenya, being a third world country?
Well, I would say that, first of all, relying on goodwill is not a good strategy.
Okay.
Because if you listen to what the president said and what the fact is, when he mentioned about the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMFs and the World Bank, and the fact that these were, established as reconstruction vehicles for post-war Europe and America. And this ecosystem and these structures have stayed decades and centuries later. That means that it mostly does not serve developing countries and poor countries. If you look at the debt matrix, if you look at the cost of credit for African countries and developing countries, it's much higher, it's much more expensive, and it has been a challenge to access external climate financing for most of these countries. That is not to say that it is all gloom and doom. We have seen a lot of global partnerships, global coming together of different institutions, different countries, but goodwill is not enough. What I would say is we need a very deliberate shift from aid to alliance, aid to investment, so that Africa and most of the developing countries in the global south are not just seen as passive recipients of aid, but investment opportunities. This way we get to balance the scale. And I would say that the opportunity in the developing countries is massive. It's huge, just by some of the innovations and the enterprises that we were mentioning earlier. So that needs to change. But at the same time, we have to also prioritize locally led development.
Yes.
at the end of the day, we have to take charge of our own development. And the president talked about Africa not just being a victim, but a solutions provider. That needs to move from rhetoric to action. So we want to see more political will. She mentioned about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. There's a lot of political will that needs to go into that. There's a lot of accountability mechanisms that needs to be built. And from the second Africa Climate Summit recently, we saw a lot of positive move in that direction with the pledging of around 100 billion by African multilateral financial institutions towards African green industrialization, which is a good step in the right direction, but that needs to be followed on with a lot of action, a lot of goodwill to put this into action. So I would address it at that.
So we'll just hold on to that thought as we explain to everyone watching at home, our viewers, and just break it down for you. So we're going to be breaking down the Kenyan climate agenda, the figures, of course. We'll have the figures running on the screen. You know, 56 billion USD is the amount required to implement Kenya's new NDCs. Now, 300 billion USD is the amount of money that developed countries should mobilize per year for developing countries. There is 62 billion USDs, that is the amount of money that Kenya projected will be required for mitigation and adaptation actions across sectors up to 2030. And the source of that is the Ministry of Environment, 2020. Now let's go on to Kenya's climate agenda. Kenya's 2020 to 2030 NDC. In case you don't know what NDC is, it's the Nationally Determined Contributions, that's NDC, National Climate Action Plans, by each country under the Paris Agreement. So they sought to abate greenhouse gases emissions by 32% by 2030, and this is in line with Kenya's Sustainable Development Agenda through a low carbon and climate resilient development pathway. Mitigation activities included in the NDC are: 1, increasing of renewables in the electricity generation mix of the national grid, the enhancement of energy and resource efficiency across the different sectors, as well as now the achievement of a tree coverage of at least 10% of the country land area, and lastly, the achievement of land degradation neutrality. Right, so remember, this is, a few things, a few figures for you to be able to understand better on what exactly Kenya's climate agenda is. Right, we're having a conversation in studio with my guests, and we'll continue to do that. Now we'll be moving over to you, Eunice, and ask you the same question with regards to, among the nationally determined contributions that were signed in 2020, and of course, by among others, former Environment CS Keriako Tobiko was to achieve a tree coverage of at least 10% of the country land area by 2030. Now, 5 years since the NDC was signed, what do you say has been the progress on this?
I would say we have worked towards achieving that in line with Article 69, right, which requires at least to get at least 10% of minimum tree cover. In 2021, we realized that we had slacked a bit. We were at 8.8%. And in 2022, we were a little bit higher. It was around 12.1 or 12.2%. But as we speak, we know that initiative by the president of ensuring that we have the 15 billion tree cover, right? So the challenge, I think, in my opinion, is we have very good numbers and targets and aspirations, but in terms of monitoring and identifying the tree covers which we have and ensuring that there's spatial equality, because as it is, we have the spatial or spatial inequality. It depends with which school you joined, the spatial inequality where we have, there's some counties which are well endowed with all sorts of tree covers compared to other counties, for example, in the northern regions. So if we could identify a way of balancing that spatial inequality, and it would go down to what Tobias was explaining earlier on matters to do with climate finance, and also ensuring that that particular department, the State Department for Forestry, has been allocated sufficient funds, and also the officers who are in charge of monitoring that are also equipped well in terms of monitoring, and not only just tree planting, but also ensuring the growth and continuity of the particular trees which have been planted. Yeah. What do you think, Tobias? Yeah, that's my opinion.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to come back to you, Tobias. But before that, I want you both to listen in to what President William Ruto had to say. Of course, his speech, I'm sure you've watched it, I'm sure you've heard it at the UN on climate issues. So we've got that particular bite.
We declared Africa not just as a victim of the crisis, but as a source of solutions, with climate action driving economic growth, transformation, and job creation for our communities. Ambition, ladies and gentlemen, cannot stand on willpower alone. Implementing our new NDCs will require US $56 billion. That is why we call on the global community to unlock the US $300 billion agreed at Baku and to accelerate negotiations towards the new $1.3 trillion goal under the Baku-Belém roadmap. Without affordable finance and without reform of the international financial architecture, the promise of climate action in Africa will remain constrained.
All right, of course, and that is President Ruto talking about climate issues today, regarding what his thoughts are when it comes to climate action, when it comes to the NDCs, when it comes to Kenya's climate agenda. Tobias, what do you make of that once again, now that we've watched it together? Anything else that you would like to add on to it?
Absolutely. What I would one, I agree with him completely, that we need to shift the narrative from seeing Africa just as a victim.
Yes.
And you know, for a very long time in any climate conversation, the cliche statement normally goes, you know, Africa is the least contributor, but mostly affected by climate change. So it's just, we've almost always just been crying wolf.
Yeah.
But we are not entirely at a disadvantage because we can get to take charge of this development. And I'll shift back to the opportunity in the private sector.
Yes.
We have seen Kenyan innovators, most of them young people, coming up with different solutions to combat climate change. In clean energy, in climate smart agriculture, an entity like eRehab, you know, doing a lot in terms of climate smart irrigation to shield farmers from the wheels of climate change and all that. We've seen a company like Jijenge turning plastic into concrete. Yes. We've seen a tech integrated company in Kisumu like Mtaka trying to address climate change in the lakeside town. We've seen companies like Gare Holdings in Eldoret looking at organic fertilizer. And these are solutions that are homegrown. These are solutions that speak to our lived experiences and our lived challenges. Right. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on the adaptation space, especially for Kenya and most of the developing countries. And I would say that the opportunity is there. Okay. And Africa and Kenya has to shift and present itself as an investment destination when it comes to the continent's green transition, rather than a passive recipient of aid and handouts, because that perpetual cycle will not get us out of the problem.
Noted.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you so much for that. Right, I'm going to move over to you, Eunice, and maybe you can tell us what your take is when it comes to the NDCs that we are seeing now. How are they different from those that have been there in the past?
Okay, so first and I think for these particular NDCs, yes, we have an approach where we are bringing on board the entire community and the country. So there's a lot of inclusivity. Okay. And there's also the aspect of gender, bringing in women who have also been affected in the past. And there's also inclusivity in terms of the children. So the voices of children and youth have been sought, were actually sought prior to during the preparation, even before the presentation of the NDCs. We also see that it is in line with the National Climate Change Action Plan 2023-2027, and one of the priority areas which we have set as a country is ensuring that children and youth, who are the owners, the architects of innovation, as Tobias is rightly saying, are brought into place and are included in the decision-making processes. So I would say that is one thing which actually stands out, that the recognition of children and youth. Then secondly, it has also strongly pronounced itself on matters to do with renewable energy, right, and the opportunity which we as a country have in terms of bringing on board investments in that particular space, as well as climate smart agriculture. So that is 2 or 3 things which I can mention with regard to this particular NDC. Yeah.
Okay. What about you, Tobias? What do you think, stands out for you, and how do you think it is different in comparison to those that we've had in the past?
Well, I would say, our very first NDC was mostly reliant on international support in terms of financing. We are seeing a shift from in this new set of NDCs, in the sense that we are trying to catalyze and incentivize local support towards the NDCs, and the embracing of a whole society approach. If that can actually be achieved, the recognition that we need to take a systems approach to it, the cross-sectoral coordination of these efforts, it would be a game changer, because climate change does not manifest in silos. It cuts across different sectors. With good renewable energy, you get to affect and positively influence agriculture. You get to influence health. You get to influence all these different sectors. So this whole of society approach would really go a long way, but also incentivizing local engagement, the private sector, the catalytic public finance to address some of these challenges. So I would say that would really be a game changer in this conversation.
Okay. Yeah. And lastly, as we wrap up, do you think that there's enough awareness when it comes to climate financing, especially in this country, in Kenya, where people really are still trying to understand the effects of climate change? We've come a long way from, what the current situation was from back in the day. I think a decade on, we've seen that there's more awareness. People are now more versed with climate issues, with the fact that climate action needs to happen. So do you think that we have still made progress and we are in a place where you can safely say that people understand what climate financing is?
Honestly, I don't think we have reached there yet. In terms of the knowledge gap, it still exists. Professor Muhu, whom I like quoting, indicates that despite the fact that we have agriculture, geography being taught in schools, and climate-related knowledge is being delivered in classrooms, what still lacks is that bit on how do we apply this knowledge into the outside world. So in terms of knowledge gap on matters to do with climate financing itself, it exists. And that is where institutions like Eden Climate Center, we come in. We focus on children and youth and try to equip them with skills. Not really try, we actually do equip them with skills and the climate innovation skills and climate tech skills and policy skills, and bring them together so that they can recreate solutions suited for them. As I was mentioning earlier, we saw how I was mentioning the National Climate Change Action Plan and how the government has set targets of ensuring that, for example, that we have a children and youth engagement strategy, whereby we have a framework of involving children across the 47 counties. Imagine if we achieved that. And also bringing on board advocacy strategies of ensuring that children are aware about these climate finance opportunities Tobias is addressing today. So that is why institutions like Eden Climate Center, we exist to bridge the gap between the government and the community, and to ensure that the knowledge that exists at the top level. So for example, when the Green Climate Fund last year at COP indicated that finances have been flowing into the developing world, and we have over 133 projects being undertaken in the developing countries. How many children, though, in Kibera, in Kilifi, are aware of even Green Climate Fund? How many children in Mlolongo or deep in Kwale County are aware of the existence of the institution which Tobias is operating from? So smaller institutions like us, we come in to bridge that gap here, and I hope at some point 10 years to come, when we have a matrix of measuring, do we have an engagement strategy? Yes, of engaging children in matters to do with climate policy. If we do, then we can do that to monitor in terms of how many children have accessed funding, how many children have engaged in policy making processes. Then we will answer that question maybe, yeah?
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So I'd like you to just listen in to what President Trump had to say regarding the greatest con job, which is climate change. And yeah, let's just listen into his views.
Entire globalist concept of asking successful industrialized nations to inflict pain on themselves and radically disrupt their entire societies must be rejected completely and totally, and it must be immediate. That's why in America I withdrew from the fake Paris Climate Accord, where, by the way, America was paying so much more than every country. Others weren't paying. China didn't have to pay until 2030. Russia was given an old standard that was easy to meet, a 1990 standard. But for the United States, we're supposed to pay like $1 trillion. And I said, this is another scam. The fact is, the United States has been taken advantage of by the world for many, many years, but not any longer, as you probably noticed. From 5,000 to 7,000 dead. In closing, I just want to repeat that immigration and the high cost of so-called green renewable energy is destroying a large part of the free world and a large part of our planet.
All right, Tobias, thoughts on that as we close?
I'm going to give you my thoughts on that. Just allow me a second to weigh in on the previous question on awareness,
okay.
If I may. And to start with, I have to congratulate you and the media house for such a program on Green Fix.
Thank you very
because that is where the conversation on awareness comes from. A lot of what we consume in society still comes from media. And for a very long time, the conversation about climate change has been almost done in apocalyptic terms. When you think about climate change, the media shows you, scorched earth and, degrees and temperatures and all that. And it's almost like a threat when the conversation is made. By this year, you're not going to be able to do this and that. And generally, people don't like to feel incompetent. You know, when you bombard them with a lot of technical jargon and all that, people do not get to take action at the end of the day. There has been a missed opportunity in showing the opportunities that are there, in showing what's working, some of these innovations that we are talking about. And that's why that conversation needs to shift. We need to demystify what climate change is and do exactly what we are doing here today and make people understand that this manifests across society.
Right.
In low yields, in prolonged drought, in dying animals and all that. So that conversation needs to be there. And the opportunity for climate investment, the opportunity for enterprises in this space is massive. If you allow me, next month we are bringing together different investors and enterprises in the climate space for an investment summit to just explore the opportunity across these different sectors. And that tells you of the massive chance that we have to fix this.
Okay.
Now, to weigh in on the video that we've just played.
Very quickly.
Yes. Now, climate change, as we mentioned earlier, is an existential threat, and it is a global conversation. And of course, everyone has a right to weigh in and give in their opinion, whether political or otherwise. But for us as a country, and for a farmer somewhere in Turkana who lost 40 herds of cattle because of a prolonged drought, or for a family staying in the coast whose home have been swept because of rising sea level,
Naivasha as well.
Naivasha as well, you cannot tell them that it is a hoax because it is a lived reality. It is a lived experience. For homes that have always been where they are, being swept with floods and all that, you cannot tell them that this is not happening.
I mean, Americans too, because of the wildfires that we saw very recently.
Precisely.
It's a reality.
So I understand that this is a sensitive conversation because the hard decisions that need to be made touch on economics. You know, that's why we talk about fair transition in terms of energy transition and all that. So yes, there are certain issues that are there. But for us, I would say we talk about the opportunity that is here and what we need to do beyond the political rhetoric and ask ourselves, what do we need to do to have that green transition? Of course, the rhetoric at that level beats and challenges the efforts that are being made, but I would say that we still have a chance to do what's right.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time. And of course, I really do appreciate the fact that we are having this conversation in studio, bringing awareness and trying to demystify things when it comes to climate change, climate action, and of course, Kenya's climate agenda. With me in studio, I've been having Eunice Njau, the founder of Eden Climate Center, as well as Tobias Belle, Communications Kenya Climate Innovation Center, that's KCIC, as we have been discussing Kenya's climate agenda. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope to continue having such conversations with you in future.
Thank you for having us.
All right.
Thank you very
Moving
much.
on, it's time for Green Warriors, where